It has been more than 16 years since a civilian working for the Navy was charged with passing secrets to Israel. Jonathan Pollard pled guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage and is serving a life sentence. At first, Israeli leaders claimed Pollard was part of a rogue operation, but later took responsibility for his work. Now, Fox News has learned some U.S. investigators believe that there are Israelis again very much engaged in spying in and on the U.S., who may have known things they didn't tell us before September 11th. Fox News correspondent Carl Cameron has details in the first of a four-part series.
Since September 11th, more than 60 Israelis have been arrested or detained, either under the new Patriot anti-terrorism law or for immigration violations. A handful of active Israeli military were among those detained, according to investigators, who say some of the detainees also failed polygraph questions when asked about alleged surveillance activities against and in the United States. There is no indication that the Israelis were involved in the 9/11 attacks, but investigators suspect that the Israelis may have gathered intelligence about the attacks in advance and not shared it. A highly placed investigator said there are, quote, tie-ins, but when asked for details, he flatly refused to describe them, saying, quote, evidence linking these Israelis to 911 is classified. I cannot tell you about evidence that has been gathered. It's classified information. Fox News has learned that one group of Israelis, spotted in North Carolina recently, is suspected of keeping an apartment in California to spy on a group of Arabs who the United States is also investigating for links to terrorism. Numerous classified documents obtained by Fox News indicate that even prior to September 11th, as many as 140 other Israelis had been detained or arrested in a secretive and sprawling investigation into suspected espionage by Israelis in the United States. Investigators from numerous government agencies are part of a working group that's been compiling evidence since the mid-90s. These documents detail hundreds of incidents in cities and towns across the country that investigators say, quote, may well be an organized intelligence gathering activity. The first part of the investigation focuses on Israelis who say they are art students from the University of Jerusalem and Bezalel Academy. They repeatedly made contact with U.S. government personnel, the report says, by saying they wanted to sell cheap art or handiwork. Documents say they, quote, targeted and penetrated military bases, the DEA, FBI, and dozens of other government facilities, and even secret offices and unlisted private homes of law enforcement and intelligence personnel. The majority of those questioned, quote, stated they served in military intelligence, electronic surveillance intercept, and or explosive ordnance units. Another part of the investigation has resulted in the detention and arrests of dozens of Israelis at American Mall kiosks, where they've been selling toys called Puzzle Car and Zoomcopter. Investigators suspect a front. Shortly after the New York Times and Washington Post reported the Israeli detentions last month, the carts began vanishing. Zoomcopter's webpage says, we are aware of the situation caused by thousands of mall carts being closed at the last minute. This in no way reflects the quality of the toy or its saleability. The problem lies in the operator's business policies. Why would Israelis spy in and on the U.S.? A General Accounting Office investigation referred to Israel as Country A and said, quote, according to a U.S. intelligence agency, the government of Country A conducts the most aggressive espionage operation against the U.S. of any U.S. ally. A defense intelligence report said Israel has a voracious appetite for information and, quote, the Israelis are motivated by strong survival instincts which dictate every facet of their political and economic policies. It aggressively collects military and industrial technology, and the U.S. is a high priority target. The document concludes, quote, Israel possesses the resources and technical capability to achieve its collection objectives.
A spokesman for the the Israeli embassy here in Washington issued a categorical denial, saying any suggestion that Israelis are spying in or on the U.S. is, quote, simply not true. There are other things to consider, and in the days ahead, we will take a look at the U.S. phone system and law enforcement's methods for wiretaps, and an investigation into the possibility that both have been compromised by our friends and allies overseas. Brett?
Carl, what about this question of advanced knowledge of what was going to happen on 9/11? How clear are investigators that some Israeli agents may have known something?
Well, it's very explosive information, obviously, and there's a great deal of evidence that they say they have collected, none of it necessarily conclusive. It's more when they put it all together. A bigger question, they say, is how could they not have known? Almost a direct quote, Brett.
This going to the fact that they were spying on some Arabs, right?
Correct.
All right, Carl, thanks very much. We reported on the approximately 60 Israelis who had been detained in connection with the September 11th terrorism investigation. Carl Cameron reported that U.S. investigators suspect that some of these Israelis were spying on Arabs in this country and may have turned up information on the planned terrorist attacks back in September that was not passed on. Tonight, in the second of 4 reports on spying by Israelis in the U.S., we learn about an Israeli-based private communications company for whom a half dozen of those 60 detained suspects worked. American investigators fear information generated by this firm may have fallen into the wrong hands and had the effect of impeding the September 11th terror inquiry. Here's Carl Cameron's second report.
Fox News has learned that some American terrorism investigators fear certain suspects in the September 11th attacks may have managed to stay ahead of them by knowing who and when investigators are calling on the telephone. How? By obtaining and analyzing data that's generated every time someone in the U.S. makes a phone call.
One sitting in city, please.
Here's how the system works. Most directory assistance calls and virtually all call records and billing in the U.S. are done for the phone companies by Amdocs Limited, an Israeli-based private telecommunications company. Amdocs has contracts with the 25 biggest phone companies in America and more worldwide. The White House and other secure government phone lines are protected, but it is virtually impossible to make a call on normal phones without generating an Amdocs record of it. In recent years, the FBI and other government agencies have investigated Amdocs more than once. The firm has repeatedly and adamantly denied any security breaches or wrongdoing. But sources tell Fox News that in 1999, the super-secret National Security Agency, headquartered in northern Maryland, issued what's called a top-secret, sensitive, compartmentalized information report, TSSCI, warning that records of calls in the United States were getting into foreign hands, in Israel in particular. Investigators do not believe calls are being listened to, but the data about who's calling whom and when is plenty valuable in itself. An internal Amdocs memo to senior company executives suggests just how Amdocs-generated call records could be used. Quote, widespread data mining techniques and algorithms, combining both the properties of the customer, like credit rating, and properties of the specific behavior such as whom the customers are calling. The Amdocs memo says the system should be used to prevent phone fraud, but U.S. counterintelligence analysts say it could also be used to spy through the phone system. Fox News has learned that the NSA has held numerous classified conferences to warn the FBI and CIA how Amdocs records could be used. At one NSA briefing, a diagram by the Argonne National Lab was used to show that if the phone records are not secure, major security breaches are possible. Another briefing document said, quote, it has become increasingly apparent that systems and networks are vulnerable. Such crimes always involve unauthorized persons or persons who exceed their authorization, acting on exploitable vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities are growing because, according to another briefing, the U.S. relies too much on foreign companies like Amdocs for high-tech equipment and software. Quote, many factors have led to increased dependence on code developed overseas. We buy rather than train or develop solutions.
U.S. intelligence does not believe the Israeli government is involved in a misuse of Amdocs information, and Amdocs insists that its data is secure. What U.S. government officials are worried about, however, is the possibility that Amdocs data could get into the wrong hands, particularly organized crime, and that would not be the first time that such a thing has happened. Fox News has documents of a 1997 drug trafficking case in Los Angeles in which telephone information, the types that Amdocs collects, was used to, quote, completely compromise the communications of the FBI, the Secret Service, the DEA, and the LAPD. And we'll have that and a lot more in the days ahead, Brett.
Carl, I want to take you back to your report last night on those 60 people who were Israelis who were detained in the anti-terror investigation, and the suspicion that some investigators have that they may have picked up information on the 9/11 attacks ahead of time, not passed it on. There was a report, you'll recall, that the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, did indeed send representatives to the U.S. to warn, just before 9/11, that a major terrorist attack was imminent. Why does that not, how does that leave room for the lack of a warning?
Well, I remember the report, Britt. We did it first internationally right here on your show on the 14th. What investigators are saying is that that warning from the Mossad was nonspecific and general, and they believe that it may have had something to do with the desire to protect what are called sources and methods in the intelligence community. The suspicion being perhaps those sources and methods were taking place right here in the United States. The question came up in the Select Intelligence Committee on Capitol Hill today. They intend to look into what we reported last night, and specifically that possibility. Brett?
So, in other words, the problem wasn't the lack of a warning, the problem was lack of useful details.
Quantity of information.
All right, Carl, thanks very much. Coming up next, Israeli-based company called Amdocs that generates the computerized records and billing data for nearly every phone call made in America. As Carl Cameron reported, U.S. investigators digging into the 9/11 terrorist attacks fear that suspects may have been tipped off to what they were doing by information leaking out of Amdocs. In tonight's report, we learned that the concern about phone security extends to another company founded in Israel that provides the technology that the U.S. government uses for electronic eavesdropping. Here is Carl Cameron's third report.
The company is Comverse Infosys, a subsidiary of an Israeli-run private telecommunications firm with offices throughout the U.S. It provides wiretapping equipment for law enforcement. Here's how wiretapping works in the U.S. Every time you make a call, it passes through the nation's elaborate network of switchers and routers run by the phone companies. Custom computers and software made by companies like Comverse are tied into that network to intercept, record, and store the wiretapped calls, and at the same time transmit them to investigators. The manufacturers have continuing access to the computers so they can service them and keep them free of glitches. This process was authorized by the 1994 Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, or CALEA. Senior government officials have now told Fox News that while CALEA made wiretapping easier, it has led to a system that is seriously vulnerable to compromise and may have undermined the whole wiretapping system. Indeed, Fox News has learned that Attorney General John Ashcroft and FBI Director Robert Mueller were both warned October 18th in a hand-delivered letter from 15 local, state, and federal law enforcement officials who complained that, quote, law enforcement's current electronic surveillance capabilities are less effective today than they were at the time CALEA was enacted. Comverse insists the equipment it installs is secure, but the complaint about this system is that the wiretap computer programs made by Comverse have in effect a back door through which wiretaps themselves can be intercepted by unauthorized parties. Adding to the suspicions is the fact that in Israel, Comverse works closely with the Israeli government and under special programs gets reimbursed for up to 50% of its research and development costs by the Israeli Ministry of Industry and Trade. But investigators within the DEA, INS, and FBI have all told Fox News that to pursue or even suggest Israeli spying through Comverse is considered career suicide. And sources say that while various FBI inquiries into Comverse have been conducted over the years, they've been halted before the actual equipment has ever been thoroughly tested for leaks. A 1999 FCC document indicates several government agencies expressed deep concerns that too many unauthorized, non-law enforcement personnel can access the wiretap system. And the FBI's own nondescript office in Chantilly, Virginia, that actually oversees the CALEA wiretapping program, is among the most agitated about the threat. But there is a bitter turf war internally at FBI. It is the FBI's office in Quantico, Virginia that has jurisdiction over awarding contracts and buying intercept equipment. And for years they've thrown much of the business to Comverse. A handful of former U.S. law enforcement officials involved in awarding Comverse government contracts over the years now work for the company. Numerous sources say some of those individuals were asked to leave government service under what knowledgeable sources call troublesome circumstances that remain under administrative review within the Justice Department.
And what troubles investigators most, particularly in New York in the counterterrorism investigation of the World Trade Center attack, is that on a number of cases, suspects that they had sought to wiretap and surveil immediately changed their telecommunications processes. They started acting much differently as soon as those supposedly secret wiretaps went into place. Brett?
Carl, is there any reason to suspect in this instance that the Israeli government is involved?
No, there's not, but there are growing instincts and an awful lot of law enforcement officials in a variety of agencies who suspect that and have begun compiling evidence and a highly classified investigation into precisely that possibility. Brett?
All right, Carl, thanks very much.
You agree on the timetable. What about the rest of the Middle East? You mentioned Israel. Do we continue to support Israel?
You know, Israel is the one democracy in the Middle East, and it has been an ally, and yes, we continue to support them. And not only do we continue to support them, but we do something that we haven't as a country done in many years, which is what we did during the Clinton administration, which is to use our influence to bring the parties to the table to try to reach a just and equitable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we need to do this because, you know, with respect to the Middle East, American families are hanging on by their fingernails right now while we spend $13 billion and our attention and our government's attention over there. It is time for us to refocus at home and start addressing energy, start addressing healthcare, stop going. Chris Shays has been to Iraq 22 times. This district needs a congressperson who is going to focus on the challenges and the issues that the people of this district are facing. And so we need to reorient ourselves to the challenges that our families face.
Okay, I don't know what he just said. He talks beautifully and says,
Israel.
no, I understand the question. It's just he talks a lot and says absolutely nothing. We need to take a tough love stand with Israel. We already know the reason why we had 9/11. Osama bin Laden was clear in our 9/11 Commission report. One of the bombers was very clear about why we were there. We are the problem here. We support the settlements. Condoleezza Rice was just there, exasperated. The settlements, 150 settlements now, no change. They keep growing. We've got hedge funds here financing settlements. We've got wealthy Americans financing settlements. 4 U.S. presidents condemned the settlements, and yet they still happen. We are hated worldwide because of our blind support amid what's happening there. We need to take a tough love stand with Israel and demand that there's a resolution and that the settlements building stop.
Tom, if I could just note, to imply, as Ms. Whitnam has, that the Israelis are directly or indirectly responsible for 9/11 is nothing shy of abominable and just indicates the extent to which she's not paying attention to what is really going on.
I'm paying a lot of attention. Let me tell you something. Since the Second Intifada began on September 2000, when Ariel Sharon walked into a mosque to get himself elected, creating a riot, so much bloodshed, and 8 times as many Arabs as Israelis have been killed, but that's not the point. The majority of the people in the Middle East, 60% of the population is younger than 30 years old, and they have come of age during this time period, Intifada, which is still going on. It's 8 years. The danger of it is this. They are seething. Getting rid of Osama bin Laden at the top, if you don't get rid of the reasons why people hate us, solves absolutely nothing. Jim talks like that because Jim was just in Israel on a 2-day, 48-hour propaganda building trip. He went there from Greenwich, put his arms around Omer. What was that all about, Jim? Was that to get your funding? Did you have to sign any documents to the AIPAC here?
I didn't sign a single document. I didn't take a dime. I went there because Israel is on the sharp point of the spear that was very important to us, which is how we deal with Islamic extremism. And I felt an obligation to go there and actually talk to people. But again, this election is not about these issues. This election is about energy policy. It is about health care. It is about reasserting our leadership economically so that we have jobs and so that we lead this world once again on things like alternative energy and so that we have a health care system that we can be proud of.
You're changing the topic, Jim. I want to talk about that again. How did you didn't answer the question. How do you go from Greenwich, Connecticut to having your arms around Prime Minister Omer? Nobody leaves and goes to talk to Israel for 48 hours during a campaign. Why did you go? Who was the go-between?
I think I explained that. I set this trip up and it was there to talk to people who are expert on these issues.
We only have 5 minutes left, and there are so many important issues here.
This is the most
one of the ones that relates to
because
this
he came back saying,
excuse me, I really want to move this on.
He came back and said, if Iran attacked Israel, that
you're not going to set the agenda any further. I'm sorry. We have to stop now, and I have to move on.
Would be severe. How dare you wage war without...
Question. How do you make the United States Congress do what you want it to do? Answer. Buy it.
How can that be done?
By making sure that a majority of senators and congresspersons are in your pocket, so to speak.
You mean bribe them?
If supporting candidates with massive campaign contributions so that they will do your bidding if they are elected is bribery, then yes, You've hit the nail on the head.
But isn't bribery illegal?
It should be, but very little seems to be done about it. The staggering amounts of money spent on U.S. elections means that it is virtually impossible to tell where campaign contributions originate, and to make things easier, the United States Supreme Court in January 2010 reversed 20 years of restrictions on corporate campaign contributions.
If I wanted to buy Congress, which candidates should I choose? Democrats or Republicans?
Both. Then you can't lose. The winner does what he's told, and the loser isn't going to report you for breaking campaign contribution rules because they've already accepted your tainted money in return for promises to further your political agenda. The system is as safe as houses, the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate.
But who would have enough money to do all this?
That's an easy one. AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. And if you're wondering where they get the money from, a lot of it comes from the American taxpayer. Every year, loyal U.S. citizens dutifully pay their federal taxes, which are then used for many purposes, one of which is to supply aid in various forms to Israel, currently estimated at being about $3 billion per year. Some of this aid is used to buy U.S.-made weapons, which allow Israel to continuously threaten its neighbors and enables them to finance the hugely expensive apartheid wall, effectively fencing off the Palestinians and making them prisoners in their own land. It is self-evident that some of this money is bound to find its way back to the United States to be used to top up the election campaign funds for politicians, who, when elected, will be very keen to vote even more aid to Israel next time around. So, not only are American taxes being used to support the apartheid state of Israel, some of that money is being used to help elect candidates who are more interested in getting re-elected than they are in America's best interests, which means that Americans are actually paying for the demise of their own democracy. Yet democracy is something which successive U.S. presidents have been crying out is a basic right for everyone on the planet. What hypocrisy! It doesn't much matter which candidate wins, Democrat or Republican, or at what level, congressperson, senator, vice president, or president. He or she, having taken the proverbial 30 pieces of silver, is now expected to do AIPAC's bidding. The penalty for not doing so being the withholding of campaign funds when the next election circus comes to town. But before that happens, the AIPAC circus is coming to town. Washington, that is, May 22nd to May 24th, 2011. But before we take a look at their agenda, I want to explain my pronunciation of the name. In all of these words, the AI combination sounds different. Diamond, daily, pair. So we have a choice. I suspect that the organization prefers AIPAC to deflect attention away from the fact that it has little to do with A for America or Americans. So I prefer to call it AIPAC, because it is definitely I for Israel-centric, as we shall see. The AIPAC Policy Conference is the pro-Israel community's preeminent annual gathering. The event attracts more than 6,000 community and student activists from all 50 states, and more than half of the Senate, a third of the House of Representatives, and countless Israeli and American policymakers and thought leaders, and so on and so forth. But it's a one-way street. Take a look at some of the issues on the agenda. You won't find much that has to do with America or Americans. Example: Israel didn't like the Goldstone report on its savage attack on Gaza in December 2008 and January 2009, so AIPAC pushed the United States Senate to vote to rescind United Nations support for the report and take no further action against Israel under its recommendations. The resolution, which passed by unanimous consent on April 14th and was sponsored by Senators Kirsten Gillibrand and Jim Risch, comes after Justice Richard Goldstone retracted the central claims of his controversial report that falsely accused Israel of targeting civilians during its caste-led military campaign. For the record, Goldstone, who was a Zionist, was put under enormous pressure by Israel to make his retractions. But the Pandora's box of Israeli atrocities had already been opened.
4 people died here, all women, shot. Having bulldozed the place, the Israelis destroyed the village water tower. The only houses left standing were those the occupying troops had camped in, or positioned snipers in. In the house they'd occupied, Israeli soldiers left some writing on the wall. "Gaza, here we are," one read. "You can run, but you can't hide. Make war, not peace. Arabs need to die. If you can take it, there's worse to come." Zaytun, a few miles north, also flattened by Israeli bulldozers. But in this house, they'd herded 100 members of the Samuni clan. And then they shelled it, killing 49 of them. The mass funeral wake is in its final day.
In September 2009, Judge Goldstone had this to say.
The mission concluded that actions amounting to war crimes, and possibly in some respects crimes against humanity, were committed by the Israel Defense Force.
But in his recent retraction, Goldstone now characterizes the killing of 29 members of the Samuni family as an accident.
She's saying if it was an accident, why they could enter our home with 18 members in it and kill my husband, murder him in front of all of these kids.
So why are these two trying to cover up Israel's appalling human rights record? And what's the going rate for that service rendered by this pair of Roman Catholic senators, one Democrat and one Republican? 30 pieces of silver for their campaign coffers? Or a bit more to take care of inflation? Or what about swimming pools for their back gardens? I wonder if they've seen what the IDF did with their battle tanks in some poor Palestinian's back garden, or rather the agricultural fields that their very livelihoods depend upon. Someone will flag this video as inappropriate. If I show the bodies of some of the over 300 children killed, or some of the over 1,600 injured in that walled and fenced-in prison, but I can show you pictures of those responsible for their deaths and horrific injuries. There are many other Israel-centric issues on its 2011 agenda, but this attempt at covering up the Goldstone report says it all as to what AIPAC is really all about, trying to protect apartheid Israel from its ever-growing number of critics. It is unconscionable, and every decent American should rise up and shout, "Enough is enough." In this graphic, the orange represents the population of the United States, approximately 310 million citizens, while the P represents the membership of AIPAC, a mere 100,000 people, a pressure group whose clearly stated aims and ambitions put the interests of Israel above and beyond any other consideration. Which means that AIPAC is, to all intents and purposes, the voice of America, and only when the voices of the majority of United States citizens are heard will this gross imbalance be redressed. This organization is doing something about it, aptly named Move Over AIPAC. Look them up on the internet and give them all the support you can. Others to look for are Stop AIPAC and Students Against AIPAC. How much longer can America afford to be squeezed for money, armaments, and the lives of its children in conflicts that have little strategic benefit for Americans, but which are turning more and more of the world against them? Take America back before it's too late.